As a network of people living with HIV, our primary role is to advocate on behalf of people living with HIV in our country. And when we talk about advocacy, the numbers are very important because you need to speak as a group, but also not just as a group, but you look at which stakeholders are influential, because advocacy is about bringing change. Advocacy is about getting the voice. Now, in that context, religious leaders are very important. Firstly, because if you look at our demographics in Malawi, I would say Malawi is a religious country. We have about 80% who are Christians, and then we have 10 to 12% Muslims. So you would actually notice that almost all Malawians belong to one religion or the other. Apart from that, our religious leaders are actually very influential. When they speak on a subject, our government would actually listen. But even the people themselves, when they speak on the podium, the people would listen. Now, as I said earlier on, that advocacy is about the numbers, advocacy is about bringing change, advocacy is about bringing voice. I believe that working with the religious leaders as a partner in our advocacy efforts would actually bring a lot of change, because it means the people themselves would hear the messages that people living with HIV want them to hear, and the government itself would also be able to listen when these religious leaders speak.
People living with HIV and AIDS are Malawians. And not only that, some are Christians, some are Muslims. And now, they have got their religious leaders. In the Muslim community, they have got their leaders. In the Christian community, they have got their leaders. And it is these leaders that in the past have actually, been in the forefront discriminating against people living with HIV and AIDS. In other words, it has been the church. The church was in the forefront, talking ill of the people living with the virus. What is your role as a church leader? You counsel, you give assistance, you help the person who is, in need. So, at the 2012 meeting that we had, these are some of the issues that we are raising. Fortunately enough, people living with the virus were there present, and they were speaking for themselves. Not that somebody was speaking for them, but they were speaking for themselves in front, before the church leaders.
In ensuring that religious leaders continuously interact with people living with HIV is very, very important. And therefore I see the dialogue as critical and as part of the one of the interventions that we need to encourage, so that we can bring some a sense of belonging and also being accepted, because previously people living with HIV were not accepted amongst the faith community. That kind of acceptance is very critical. And this will also encourage many people to disclose their status. And therefore, it will have an impact on the HIV transmission itself, but also completely reduce stigma and discrimination, which we are trying to fight. And it will eventually enable us to meet our target of zero discrimination.
It has been proved that stigma and discrimination acts as a barrier for people living with HIV to access the services. So the government and other stakeholders might do their best to ensure that the services are available. But as long as the stigma and discrimination towards people living with HIV still persist, then it means people living with HIV will not be able to access such services. The other finding from the stigma index study actually was that stigma and discrimination towards people living with HIV is prevalent in different settings, including within the church or within the mosques. Now, when we had the first dialogue meeting with the religious leaders, they were surprised because they were not aware of this. So the issue of stigma and discrimination is one such issue that we would want the religious leaders to talk about. As I said earlier on, the moment they speak on a subject, people listen, the government listens. So what we have been asking the religious leaders is they should incorporate these issues as part of their sermons that they give when they are preaching the word of God.
We had faith leaders from the mainline churches and faith institutions in the country. And we discussed the importance of dialoguing with people living with HIV. We presented to them the documentation, the stigma index study that was done. We also, as the Malawi Interfaith, gave them results of our operation research that we conducted in 2006 on stigma within the faith community. And the results were so overwhelming that the faith leaders were so moved and mobilized that they wanted to do something, and therefore came up with a roadmap that we all agreed to implement. As I'm speaking now, some of the things which we agreed was to ensure that the faith community has a workplace policy, a consolidated one, that all the faith institutions can use. I am in the process of doing the consolidation, and we should be meeting any time now. So this is one of the direct results of that meeting.
Our future plans are to build on the achievements that we already realized from the first framework for dialogue. So, for instance, one of the achievements is that we formalized the relationship between the networks of people living with HIV and religious leaders in our country. Before that, we did not have a formal kind of organized way of talking to each other. And as a result of the first dialogue that we had, the religious leaders themselves actually opened up their doors to people living with HIV, so that if there are any issues that we need to bring to their attention, we should be free to bring them to their attention. To me, that was a milestone, that now we had established a formal relationship between networks of people living with HIV and the religious leaders. But also, as a result of that, we have actually seen that religious leaders are talking about issues that primarily they were always silent about. So the first thing I would talk about is the issue of stigma and discrimination towards people living with HIV. As a result of the Framework for Dialogue meeting that we had, most of the religious leaders are in the forefront to talk against the stigma and discrimination towards people living with HIV. They have also started talking about issues to do with the condoms, but of course, according to their stand in our context, they are saying they are ready to promote the use of condoms within the marriage setup. So these are some of the achievements that we have registered from the first framework for dialogue. Looking into the future, we want to continuously engage them. In fact, what we want to do is to have scheduled meetings with the religious leaders, because it is our responsibility to bring the issues that affect people living with HIV at any point in time to religious leaders, so that they are part and parcel of our advocacy efforts.
Here in Malawi, I don't know in India, in Pakistan, in the UK, but here in Malawi, we are affected. Every home is affected. Every family is affected. It will be my brother-in-law, my niece. For your information, I just lost my niece 2 months ago. And her husband is very sick. She left a young, about 1.5-year-old boy. He is also very sick. Of course, the same thing. So this is why we are saying everyone is affected. So even if I castigate her, I know that back home I have, my niece who's suffering. I have a brother-in-law suffering. So this thing is affecting everyone. So for somebody to pretend that, in the church you want people who are, HIV free, that is nonsense. That's not true. That's not true. So I'm hoping that having that meeting, the first one, I think the second one will be a success too.